Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today we have Neal Pollard. Neal is currently a partner at Controls Risk, where he leads their Digital Risks Advisory for Americas. Before his current role, Neal was in financial services and consulting, and he spent 17 years in the U.S. counterterrorism community, including assignments with the CIA and the National Counterterrorism Center.
I am very excited to welcome Neal and quite intrigued because guess what? We have tons in common. Yes, we both worked at the same bank. We both came from PwC. We both lived in Europe. We both teach at Columbia. We live in the same area and we both have dogs.
Ooh.
Are we printed from the same template, just in a very different factory each? I'm starting to worry that we are actually a walking example of the very topic we are discussing, concentration risks. Either way, welcome to the show, Neal.
So today, Alicia and I are speaking with Neal Pollard, and the three of us have actually worked together before in the banking world. We've done some board work together, and we all happen to be professors at Columbia University as well. So, Neal, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thank you.
So let's build on that education background that we share, right? And so to set the stage for this discussion, let's do a quick 101 on today's topic, which is concentration risk. And I think kind of that classic concentration risk analogy is don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And it's a concept board members understand, certainly from a financial perspective. But as organizations are now migrating from on-prem to the cloud, there really are only a few big baskets out there. So from your perspective, how does this definition of risk change in the boardroom? And by the way, as we go through this today, we don't have to focus just on cloud concentration. As we've talked about, regulators are increasingly looking for boards to demonstrate active oversight as well, which I think is sparking a whole new debate in the governance community around concentration risk of expertise in the boardroom as well. But let's start with that cloud piece.
Okay, well, let me take a crack at it. I mean, I think when you're trying to understand concentration risk, and especially how it's changed, especially since the advent of cloud services, but also since the advent of what role they're playing in AI, and what role AI is playing in digitalization and digital products, and that role cannot be understated. The World Economic Forum says that up to 70% of new economic value is going to be generated by digitalization and digital products. So AI is important. Cloud is important. There's no question about that. But how concentration risk has changed, especially over the past 2 or 3 years, I think a perfect example is from the industry that we all came from, which is the bank that's too big to fail. And in 2008, in the creation of the concept of the GSIB, the Global Systemically Important Bank, too big to fail. Now we may have one or two banks out there that are too big to bail, but
we do know that.
Yeah, exactly. But you came up with this new concept of, wow, that's concentration risk, but we can't do anything about it. We can't remove those providers from the ecosystem, and it just so happens that what they do, they actually do quite well. So we have, 13, 14 GSIBs. We have 3, arguably 4 major world-class cloud providers out there. Okay, so there's 4. How do you get away from concentration risk? So it's one of those things that you don't get away from it, you manage it. Whereas, that were too much eggs in that basket, let's switch to another basket or split it among 2 or 3 baskets. Right. There's no more than 4 baskets you can split it by, right? So that's one challenge. But before you try to outspin the really hard problems, come back to fundamental basics. And this is something that I've seen as a consultant. This is something I've seen being on the industry side, which is, okay, which one of our suppliers is the most important? Concentration risk, show me the list of third parties, supply chain providers, however you want to characterize it. Show me the list of who's most important, who's least important. And in the average given global company, get 5 or 6 different lists with zero overlap in terms of the ranking. Sometimes zero overlap in terms of who's on it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a fundamental problem that is endemic to a lot of third-party risk management systems before you even get to the concept of concentration risk.
So actually, on that note, I think there's been a shift as well with boards, especially in financial services. Boards are aware that there is a necessary shift from security to operational resiliency. But we still hear a simplified understanding underpinning it of concentration risk, like you said. All eggs in one basket, in one region, in the hands of one supplier, etc. So And sometimes also understanding, some guy in IT is going to handle it. So there is a kind of double-angled question, Neil, I have. How do you advise boards and security leaders to marry the concepts of resiliency and concentration risks? You spoke about management of concentration risk, but how can they manage it better whilst having on their mind the effective operational resilience as well?
Right. And again, you go with what you know, and we all know the financial services sector really well, but I think it's valuable too because risk management from the modern perspective, as we know it, was largely generated by the financial services sector. But again, the concept of GSIB, too big to fail, concentration risk in the financial services industry globally, the system, has some lessons that you could take away that are useful for board members on answering this concentration risk question, nothing to do with finance, which is, well, what does it mean to be a GSIB? What does it mean to be systemically important? And the Financial Stability Board in Basel came up with exactly what that means. Interconnectivity, unreplaceability. If your service goes down, is there someone else who can step in like that? I think there's 5 or 6 different criteria of what it means to be systemically important, which means if you fail, it has knock-on effects across the entire system. Okay, we'll take out the global financial services system and put in our corporate system. And you can come up with analogous questions to ask about the centrality of any given supplier or any given capability. Like, what are the top 5 digital capabilities we have that, if any one failed, would most quickly stop revenue or halt operations globally? Which is a corporation's version of systemic risk, right? What would still work if any of those capabilities were out for 30 days? What is the time to recover? How do you know? And who said we're okay with that? You start asking questions like that and focus on digital capabilities, not one tool, but capabilities that are in a connectivity. And you start asking the questions around dependencies, blast radius, and how to keep failures from spiraling uncontrollably when tools and technologies themselves fail. Then you're getting into questions that unpack what the concentration is, what the risk is, and how expensive it's going to be to manage all this.
So elaborating on that, there's also a paradox underlining on that. Was it to diversify or was it to reduce complexity? And if we take a scenario that's all too familiar to us, especially those who commute to work from New Jersey to New York and jump on the train thinking, great, I'm missing all this traffic. We all funnel into the one tunnel under the Hudson River and think we're going to be efficient. We beat all those thousands of cars going into New York City. And that's good. That's good standardization. It scales, it's great. Until it goes wrong and we get stuck in the tunnel. Then we're stuck, the nightmare begins, you can't even text anyone to say you're going to be late and you just have to wait. So that's the bad kind of concentration. So how do you help a board spot the balance, spot the difference? When does a standard platform stop being a high-speed rail, although we're yet to find one in New Jersey, of course, and start becoming a single point of failure that we need to eliminate?
It's very difficult to underplay the complexity problem and it's to understand where those true dependencies lie. And you mentioned the Manhattan example. There was also it's the 25th anniversary of 9/11. When 9/11 happened, a lot of power was knocked out in lower Manhattan. But a lot of people had thought through that, not because, a terrorist attack, but power could be knocked out. So let's get uninterrupted power supplies, UPSs that are generated by diesel fuel, and that'll keep the electricity on. Yes, except for the complexity they didn't think through, which is those run out of diesel. And on 9/11, the tunnel was shut for good security reasons, but the tunnel was shut and the diesel trucks couldn't get through. So mapping out those complexities is not a trivial challenge, but that is the job of the risk managers who own that risk. So back to the board question, I think there's 2 questions they can center on to make sure that those risks are being effectively managed. The first one is a question of tolerances, of appetites. How long can we do it? Like you give the New Jersey Transit, which unfortunately I'm as familiar with as you are. If your tolerance, when you ask the question, what time is it, is the answer is 12:30, then no, you don't have the tolerances for the concentration risk that New Jersey Transit presents. If your tolerance is okay that when you ask what time it is and the answer is it's Tuesday, okay, then your tolerance risk for New Jersey Transit is fine because you'll get there on time because it's Tuesday, maybe. So where are our tolerances? Going back to that, what are the digital capabilities that we have that if they went down, they could interrupt revenue or global operations? And What happens if they're out for X days? It's the X days. What is the X day that is no longer tolerable? Who set that and why? So that's one question you ask. The second question is, has anyone done the math? And this goes to the fundamental assumption that there are efficiencies, that there are cost savings in taking a centralized approach, which generates the concentration risk. But when you go back to all the converged risks that are inherent in some of these, AI, data centers, physical risk, digital risk, cyber risk, energy, power, water risk, geopolitical risk, supply chain risk, none of which is managed by one person at the C-suite or even C-suite minus three. But when you add up the costs of managing all those risks, it starts to tally up a pretty high risk, especially since so much of it is at the whims of geopolitics these days. The second question boards should be asking is, first of all, who's accountable for all of these different risks? And have you done the math? Show us the math that managing all the different myriad angles of concentration risk are worth the efficiencies we get from this risk. Because at least with diversification, there is transparency.
Yeah, I really like that. And so kind of building on that, we're seeing the concentration risk isn't just about a single provider. It's about the geopolitical exposure. It's about the potential business impact. And Neal, you've used a great metaphor in the past that I think is really relevant in this discussion, which is organizations need to decide if they want their CISO to be an operator or to be a diplomat. I love this analogy as a former cyber liaison to NATO. Anytime we can talk international relations, I'm in. So with the rise now of these data sovereignty laws, the risks of systemic shocks from regional conflicts, why is that diplomatic skill set now so critical? And how do they help a board navigate the reality that digital infrastructure is now a piece of really this bigger global geopolitical puzzle?
Right. Well, let me start by saying the word operator has multiple meanings, and you want your CISOs to be operators. I mean, a lot of CISOs come up either through the engineering world, the operations world, or the risk and compliance world. And operations has one sense, operating cyber operations and defense and facing off against adversaries. But then, to give credit where credit's due, our foreign service.
Yeah.
The best foreign service officers are operators too. There's
Yeah.
a reason why CIA Director Burns was such an effective CIA director, is because he was a diplomat. But when you look at just what CISOs are responsible for, managing that kind of risk that permeates so many different business operations and understanding and introducing to the business the concept of cyber risk or digital risk and saying, you tell me what's important and I'll tell you the friction involved in protecting what's important to what we agree is the right risk tolerance, right? That sounds a little convoluted, but getting them to agree that that's the right amount of friction to impose upon their business, that takes more diplomacy than it does math.
Yeah.
And explaining that, getting others to manage what's important to a CISO, where it could be fraud, or it could be insider risk, or it could be digitalization risk and AI. That goes beyond the budget and controls that a CISO has plenary control over. You need the cooperation of other people who own control stacks throughout building. Also, the business people who will own the risk, but own the business and the profits and chafe at the friction that you want to introduce. You need your diplomatic skills to do that. But when you also look, broader to what we're talking about, concentration risk and AI and data centers, we've talked about a few times, we're getting into an environment globally where when you look at the choke points and converge risks that AI is presenting, whether it's managing, the untrustworthiness of some agentic AI itself, or the role of the data centers, where you have to negotiate power, water risks, energy risks, physical risks, cyber risks, choke points of satellites and undersea cables, access to talent, supply chain chips. All of those are increasingly dominated by geopolitical considerations, to the point that, as my company, Control Risks, has pointed out, it's getting to a point where companies that have this reliance for their digitalization strategy will need to engage in getting permission to compute, getting permission through a geopolitical and regulatory lens, as well as an operational lens, of securing what you need for your digitalization strategy and managing these concentration risks. That requires capital D diplomacy to navigate the geopolitical, legal, and regulatory hurdles that sometimes are very unpredictably being thrown up these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
So taking this now to the context of the boardroom and CISO entering the boardroom. Pretty complex stuff, as we have discussed, but we both spent years in the trenches of refining board reporting, and we know very well that the holy grail of it is stripping the technical risk verbiage to actual so what in business terms. But it takes the right person, right? A person that doesn't need a board member to have a PhD in computing or engineering to understand the message. So the effective CISO has to act as a translator. How do you hire for that?
Well, so there is some question about whether CISOs need to be in the C-suite or a CISO should report to a CEO. I think those miss what the important fundamental questions are in terms of what empowers a CISO to get the job done effectively. But irrespective of C-suite reporting or not, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, is a cybersecurity executive, an executive with a capital E, which means if I'm interviewing, I'm going to be looking for two skills that the CISO would have in common with anybody else in the C-suite. And everyone in the C-suite, head of HR, chief legal officer, chief financial officer, they all come from different backgrounds, different training. Some of them have different legally required certifications. A CPA may or may not understand, or may not be able to pass a bar exam, and a JD, a lawyer, may not be able to pass. Doesn't matter. They all have two fundamental skills that a CISO absolutely has to have. First of all, they know the business. They know the business well. Secondly, they can explain to the board what it is they do for a living in words that the board can use to execute their governance duties. Those are two fundamentally critical skill sets that any CISO has to have, and that puts them in the same company, not necessarily the same rank, but definitely the same company as anybody else in the C-suite.
So what would be the one question a CEO should ask a candidate to see if they look like a effective CISO? Could they explain a complex issue like concentration risk clearly with the business trade-offs needed and actually the impact on the business?
Yeah, and sometimes it's difficult to ask questions that are pointed to CISOs if they don't understand, what the control stack already looks like, but that's okay. So you come up with questions of how do you approach different scenarios. And the question I think you're asking is how do you approach the scenario of briefing a board? So one question to ask a CISO is if you were sitting on a board, what questions would you be asking of your CISO? Because that's what the CISO is going to be prepared to answer. And if they say things like, I would be asking my CISO, are we meeting our SLAs for external facing vulnerability patching? Okay, that's one approach to explain to the board what it is you do for a living. But if the questions are around the areas of, is there anything fundamentally broken or missing? Are we exercising due care? Are we outliers in a bad way with our peers? Are we within risk appetites? A lot of questions that you don't have to use the word cyber, but they get to the fundamental question of where are we within our risk? Are we within tolerances or appetites? Who signed off on those and why? And what else do we need to do to reduce it further, or are we okay? Basic risk questions. If those are the questions that a CISO being on a board would ask another CISO, then you're getting to the perspective of this is how they're going to represent the program. This is how I have confidence they're not going to confuse performance metrics with risk metrics. When the board says, what's our risk? And they start telling you how great their controls are. That's not what I asked, because there is risk. There's always going to be, cybersecurity and cyber risk has always been one of the highest residual operational risks.
Yeah, SOX controls. I'm not going to tell
exactly.
you if you're
There's always going to be, the only way you can
Right.
reduce residual risk to next to zero is to disconnect from the internet and fire all the humans. Okay. Most companies would go bankrupt if you do that. So then the next question is, what is our residual risk and who accepted that? And what are we doing to maintain that? Are we outliers compared to our peers in a bad way? Is there something fundamentally broken or missing? And at the end of the day, are we exercising due care? Because bad things happen. Either they get broken, misconfigured, or they get attacked. That happens. That's not the important question whether it happened or not. The important question is, were we doing what we're supposed to be doing? And the only way you can know we're doing what we're supposed to be doing is to have executive skills to brief the board and saying, yes, now please ask me your sharp questions about risk.
So let's briefly chat about the future of board governance and revisit the discussion I brought up at the beginning of the episode around discussions for board members concentrating all of the subject matter expertise into one person on the board versus kind of spreading it out to all of the directors in the room. Because the big takeaway, I think, from this whole discussion is that concentration risk is a systemic business risk. It impacts audit, it impacts finance, it impacts operations. And so I saw this firsthand when I was working in operational resiliency in one of the former banks I was at, is that if you have these silos in place, you're not going to be able to fully address the risk, or there are going to be pieces of it that you're missing for sure. Looking forward, 2030, let's say, down the road a bit, what is going to be the concept of cyber committees for boards? Is that something that's going to be a relic of the past, or is that going to be kind of the new standard moving forward?
I think that This is my opinion. I think it'll be a relic of the past if it ever was actually a thing in the past, because there aren't a lot of just freestanding, solely dedicated cyber committees. The Securities and Exchange Commission kicked around the question as to whether to require boards to disclose in their annual filings, 10Ks, proxy statements, whatever, who the cyber expert was on the board, with the subtle implication you should have a cyber expert on the board. Cyber risk is one of many operational risks. It's a pretty important one. It's one that is driven uniquely by humans that want to do bad things to good people and good companies. It's the under attack side of the broken, misconfigured under attack reasons why technology fails. But it's just one of many risks. And board seat is precious real estate to give up on a single esoteric risk that can be managed and reported to the board by an executive level cybersecurity executive. Just like any other single risk typically is reported to the board, and there's a committee that deals with the general aggregation of risk. So I think that if you dedicate that precious real estate, you're also sort of letting the rest of the board off the hook on managing something that is a strategic issue, or can be, because it can, have existential or certainly material impact. So everyone can tune out when the CISO comes in. It'll just be one person ask the questions. And I don't think that really does justice to what the responsibilities of a board director are. But secondly, I think it misses the broader question, which is digitalization. I think rather than figure out who should be the cyber expert of the board should be seeking opportunities to improve the digital DNA and fluency of digitalization among all board directors. Going back to what we mentioned earlier, the economic forum, 70% of future economic value is going to be generated by digitalization and digital products. Okay, that's a fundamental question of value creation as an output of the corporate strategy. And risks to that value are board level risk, not a committee risk, but a board level risk. So there does need to be an improvement of fluency in digital DNA where they can understand all the risks. Cyber is one risk to digitalization, but so are choke points of undersea cables and satellites and power and water and AI and all the other concentration risks we're talking about. Getting more fluent in that, I think, is a fundamental responsibility of being a governor on a board.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. So before we wrap up today, I always like to give the guests the final drop the mic moment. Is there one action that you would recommend for folks that are listening to today's episode, or is there one piece of advice that you just want to share before we wrap up today on the topic?
Don't confuse progress metrics for risk metrics.
And with that, Neal, thank you for joining us in the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.